Hello and welcome to Submarines 101. Here we are going to learn everything about submarines and World of Warships that you need to know to either counter them or to play them yourself. This will be an overall view of everything about submarines, including dealing damage to them, avoiding damage to them, and doing damage to them. First, we will start with some of the basic mechanics of submarines, or at least the ones that are of concern. So, we'll start with speed. Everyone knows that in World of Warships, submarines have a reputation for being quite a bit too fast. But in reality, this is actually only a select few submarines that end up going this fast. As you can see here, you can see the max speed of all submarines in the game using Ship Tools filter. Only a few submarines actually manage to exceed 30 knots, and to get over 33 knots, it's only 3 of them. Now, of course, the signal CRM mic will increase that speed by 5%, and you have an 18% speed boost with enlarged propeller shaft, but that is actually only situational. When it comes to enlarged propeller shaft, it's good to understand how it works. As it says in the tooltip, enlarged propeller shaft only works when less than 50% of the submarine's battery remains, and it gives you an 18% speed boost. This is at the surface level or at periscope depth, so this will not give you a speed boost at 30 or 60 meters, which are both considered maximum depth. It is also worth noting that submarines go the exact same speed whether they are on the surface or at periscope depth, meaning that yes, a submarine can indeed use this and go full speed at periscope depth while having a lower concealment. Meaning, for example, something like salmon, which is rather common to see, you could take 33 times 1.05, which gives you 34.65. Then if it has a 50% battery, since you do use battery at periscope depth, you can kind of manage your battery to keep it right below 50% by popping up to the surface, then diving again to get that extra speed boost, though that does kill some speed. You can get up to about 40, if it would let me, yes, so 40.9 knots about is what you can get up to. This is both, once again, on the surface or at periscope depth. So it's worth looking at an enemy's submarine battery monitor to see how fast they may be going. Especially when chasing them down, this could be important. You should always assume that they have enlarged propeller shaft, assuming that they do indeed have hands, a 10-point captain, half of a brain, and react to outside stimuli. Next up, we should probably cover how diving works. There are 4 stages of diving: surface, periscope, 30 meters, and 60 meters. 30 and 60 meters are both considered maximum depth. At this depth, you cannot be spotted, not even by assured detection range. The only way you can be spotted at maximum depth, both 30 and 60 meters, is through submarine surveillance or hydroacoustic search. Other than this, you cannot be spotted. At periscope and surface level depth, you can be spotted by hydroacoustic search and RPF, which will tell the enemy the nearest target. RPF does not work against submarines below periscope depth. Hydroacoustic search works different against submarines than most other ships. It does actually well, it states exactly what it does, but some people have a hard time understanding it, so I'll explain it. If a submarine is at surface level or periscope depth, it follows the rule for detection of ships by hydroacoustic search. In other words, against Worcester, if a submarine is within 5 kilometers on the surface or at periscope depth, it will be detected. However, a submarine at 30 or 60 meters will only be detected by hydroacoustic search within 2 kilometers, or the assured detection range is a good way to think about it. Assured detection range will only work against submarines if you have hydroacoustic search active. It doesn't matter if it's a short-range personal hydro or a long-range German one, they all have the same submarine detection. Another thing worth noting is radar only works against fully surfaced submarines. It will not work against submarines at the periscope depth. However, it does have full range effect against submarines, so a submarine on the surface within 9 kilometers of Worcester will be detected by surveillance radar. Commander skills to look at for the submarines are, there's generally only a few you're ever going to actually need to consider. Liquidator increases the low flooding chance of submarine torpedoes. They all have a very low flooding chance, somewhere between 30 and 40%, which before modifiers is already low enough. After modifiers, you're talking about maybe a 10%, 5% flood chance in reality if you hit a torpedo belt. So it is a good skill to take Liquidator and to increase your flooding chance, and you should assume the enemy has it. And of course, you should always assume that any torpedo that hits you is going to cause flooding. Once again, to attempt to negate flooding, attempt to take any torpedoes on the torpedo belt, or better yet, do not take them at all, as acoustic homing torpedoes are actually rather easy to dodge once you get the hang of it. As for priority target and incoming fire alert, I would never take either of these. If you are detected, you should assume that your priority target is basically 12, and if you can react to outside stimuli, you don't really need incoming fire alert for a submarine, because quite frankly, if you assume you're targeted by 12 people, you can assume that someone's shooting at you, and if you can look at that half of the map, you can probably see the tracers. Helmsman. Helmsman, quite frankly, I mean, it's a good throwaway skill if you have an extra point, but it's kind of a gimmick because it gives you 10% rudder shift and diving plane time, but it only works within 15 seconds of activating the hydrophone, which is oddly specific, but something, I guess. And enhanced sonar, it only reduces your sonar cooldown if you're detected. You're in a submarine. You should really try to not be detected while actively pinging people. I have heard that Last Stand is a noob trap, per se, as your engine and steering gears don't get broken very often in a submarine, and I've heard it's impossible to break them with depth charges. Only with shellfire have I seen them broken, and I've only had it happen once. So it's debatable, as if you want to really take Last Stand, perhaps it would be better to invest it into preventative maintenance, that way they don't break to start with. So this is a debatable choice right here. I would probably say go with preventative maintenance. I just don't want to pay to respect this captain, because I didn't find that out until later. As far as consumable enhancements, it's okay. 5% action time really probably is not worth 2 skill points, but if you have the points, throw it in there. It shouldn't be your first choice, though. Torpedo reloading. This only works when your submarine is detected. Once again, you should try to not be detected. But it is a reload boost, so something, I guess. And improved battery capacity. Now, this is a trade-off. I personally would not recommend taking this for American submarines, as their entire gimmick is that they recharge their battery quickly at the surface. You completely negate this if you take this skill in exchange for not that much more dive capacity, because it's percentage based, and Americans already have the lowest base battery level, so you're increasing it by less, and you're hitting your overall recharge rate harder. So this probably hits Americans the worst, compared to it would be best for something like the British, who have comically high battery reserves but an already low recharge rate. So for the British, you should probably take this. For the Germans, it probably depends on your playstyle. For the Americans, I don't really recommend it, but it could still be useful, as sometimes that 10% can make a difference, and you're not really always under pressure when recharging your battery, though you will find sometimes that that quick recharge rate can get you out of some sticky situations. Superintendent is an amazing skill for submarines because you have a limited amount of important consumables, such as emergency battery reserves for the Germans, and DCP for all submarines. It's always good to have an extra charge of DCP. Watchful is a great skill to have, I just don't have the points to have it. This will always tell you if you are in the action zone of things that will detect you. This is an important skill to have, though at the same time you should also probably be aware of your surroundings to start with, but it is nice to also have. Consumable specialists. This should be a guaranteed take. There's no reason not to run this. 15% consumable preparation and reload time is astronomically important when it comes to submarines, because you can get your DCP charges up quicker, everything just in general reloads faster, but most importantly, it's that preparation and reload time, which basically, this is a direct advantage over submarines, other submarines in every other way, because your default action time, if I can pull it up real quick, let me find my cache flip. Your default preparation time for submarine surveillance is 330 seconds, which amounts to 5.5 minutes. Now, after you take this skill, you decrease that by 15%, because it also affects the initial preparation time, which goes to 280.5 seconds, which comes out to 4.67 seconds. So you almost beat other submarines in getting your submarine detection up by almost a whole minute. What this means is if you are within range of attacking an enemy submarine with your submarine surveillance, as soon as it comes up at the start of the battle, you can basically stay undetected the whole time you're detecting them, and by the time theirs comes up, you've already finished your attack and can surface and run away where you will not be detected. On the note of detection, it's also worth noting that submarine surveillance only detects submarines that are at periscope, 30 meters, or 60 meters, known as maximum depth. It will not detect submarines on the surface. So if you are detected by submarine surveillance, it is a good idea to surface, assuming it will not immediately get you killed. As for hydrophone can also detect submarines in the way it silhouettes people and updates their map position, their last known map position. Of course, it only does it in pings, and it only works if a submarine is on the surface or on periscope depth, but it's also worth noting. Alright, so back to the commander skills. I do not personally recommend taking Sonarsman, as you should be trying to get double pings and not be nerfing those, but at the same time it can also be a good skill against destroyers where it's hard to get double pings because they're very maneuverable. It will increase your single ping time by a significant amount, but it will nerf your double ping time by a decent amount. Your double pings will still last about 40-some seconds, but I'm not really sure if it's worth the trade, as keeping that 50-second double ping on battleships can be quite useful. And having a 50-second perma ping throughout a destroyer's DCP is rather useful if you manage to land one as well. But the single ping can help against destroyers and cruisers sometimes. So I personally don't recommend it, but it's not necessarily a bad skill. As for Enhanced Impulse Generator, do not use this. I quite frankly don't know what they were thinking when they made this skill. This increases your sonar ping velocity by 15%, but only when your battery is below 33% of your maximum dive capacity. This completely throws off your muscle memory of aiming and just makes it harder to hit pings because it throws off your muscle memory. You should get used to one speed and stick with it. I really don't. And it's 33%. I mean, how often are you pinging things at specifically below 33%? Especially for a 3-point skill, I don't know what they were thinking. I already touched on Enlarged Propeller Shaft. Once again, if you have hands, a brain, and can react to outside stimuli, please indeed do take Enlarged Propeller Shaft and assume every submarine you see has Enlarged Propeller Shaft. Once again, it's a good idea to manage your battery, especially with American submarines. They benefit most from this because they're already the fastest, and they regenerate their battery the fastest. So they take the least amount of downside from this, and you don't have to go underwater for 2.5 minutes just to proc it. You only have to be underwater for a minute or so to proc it. So it's quicker to proc and quicker to negate the downsides of using it. So American submarines, this is an absolute must-have, but quite frankly, take this for every single submarine you have. I mean, maybe the exceptions being like something, I don't know, the first 2 British submarines that go all of 20 knots, you know? I mean, you could debate if there's really a difference between 23 point some knots and 20 knots in this game, And especially since they have like a 5-minute battery, you have to sit underwater for 2.5 minutes at like a maximum speed of 10 knots to achieve that to start with. So, you know, maybe for British submarines, but in general, take this. Improved battery efficiency is definitely a good skill for most submarines, but it is rather expensive. I would say this is a late captain skill, like once you're getting towards a 21-point captain, this would be a good skill to take. I would only personally take this after Adrenaline Rush unless you constantly find you're not recharging your battery fast enough, but that's up to you. Adrenaline Rush, it is improved on submarines. Instead of 0.2, it is 0.25% per 1% of HP lost, but it comes with the downside of being a 4-point skill instead of the normal 3-point skill found on every other ship. But it is an improved Adrenaline Rush. Now, theoretically, in submarines, you shouldn't be taking a huge amount of damage, but inevitably, you're probably going to eat a depth charge here or a depth charge there from being spotted for a split second. It's just the way it is, because everyone hard focuses submarines, as you, quite frankly, probably should. So, eventually you're going to take damage, and extra reload ain't nothing to scoff at. I mean, you know, just throwing more torpedoes at the enemy's already overloaded DCP. What's the complaint about? Also, I don't know why airstrikes are listed, given no submarine in the game has airstrikes. Foreshadowing, by the way. Sonarman Expert. Now, once again, this is one of those just really weird skills that I don't really get. I mean, I guess for things with unlimited charges of the hydrophone consumable, which is most submarines, this could be a good skill because you could just pop your hydrophone for no reason just so you can get longer lasting pings. I'm not sure if it's worth 4 skill points. I've never used it, but if you really need longer lasting pings, this gives you plus 25% duration to both once and twice highlighted sectors after popping your hydrophone. This is within 30 seconds of activating the hydrophone consumable. I don't know why they tied it to the hydrophone consumable, but whatever, they did. And this. I personally would never take Torpedo Aiming Master. Even though it looks amazing to start with, there is a catch to this skill. This skill only works if you have and maintain a double ping with acoustic homing torpedoes the whole time, meaning you have to get a double ping before you even launch the torpedoes. This lets the enemy, 1, know your position twice, 2, it lets them know that they're going to get torpedoed by a submarine, and gives them a massive amount of reaction time, since you haven't even launched the torpedoes yet. And 3, it takes forever to do, because you have to ping twice, which takes about 15 to 20 seconds, then you have to wait for the torpedoes to get there, which is going to take about another 30 seconds, just for 15% damage, which will, quite frankly, probably be mitigated when they inevitably either A, dodge them, because they, you know, had like a minute warning of the torpedoes coming at them, or just DCP, and if they DCP, well, you did not maintain the lock, so even if the torpedoes hit after they DCP, you don't get the 15% damage bonus. Now, don't get me wrong, I understand 15% damage is a decent amount, but for what you have to do to get this, it's just simply not worth it. Now that covers all the submarine skills. Now, let's move on to dealing damage to submarines. This is the dealing damage to submarines portion. I won't necessarily go over the commander skills in depth because, I mean, they're rather self-explanatory in what they do, but let's go over how you deal damage to submarines. I'm taking this from the wiki. I'm not going to go over it in actual detail because you can just go read it yourself, but this has some amazing information. I recommend you come here and read it if you want a super in detail look. Now, here's splash damage in this game against submarines is simple and complicated at the same time. So you can see here that they have a million different things in all their splash radiuses. That's the radius in which you will deal damage to a submarine. Splash radius will always deal the same amount of damage. Always. You will never do a different amount of damage within the splash radius. It's either, for depth charges, it's either a direct hit or a splash hit. It's kind of like a full pen versus an over pen or a full pen versus a citadel. It either is or it isn't. There's no in between. uh, okay, I guess saturated part. Don't think about that. Pretty much, just think about it like this. It's either going to be a citadel or it's going to be a full pen. And you can only get a citadel, per se, against submarines with a direct hit with a depth charge. Everything else is splash damage, even direct hits, which is weird, but or at least from what I've seen. I don't know. Maybe it's different, but quite frankly, how often do you really get direct hits against submarines anyway? If you're getting direct hits against submarines, they probably don't have hands, and quite frankly, I mean, you should probably be aiming for direct hits to start with. So these are all the splash radiuses. Something you will notice is that the splash radius of HE and SAP shells are about twice the amount of the splash radius of their AP shell counterparts. Now, it is worth noticing the splash damage coefficients. For shells, AP shells will do 1/10 of their alpha damage to submarines in splash damage. This means it will do overpen damage. The same amount of damage an AP shell does in an overpen, it will do to a submarine in splash damage. HE shells have a lower coefficient, or actually I suppose it's a higher coefficient, and it nerfs your damage less, but HE shells also have significantly lower damage to start with. For something like Vermont, it's pretty obvious to see what this does. I have the numbers up here. An AP shell from Vermont will do 1,570 damage if you get a splash. But an HE shell from Vermont will only do, I believe it was 1,064 damage with a splash. But once again, I draw your attention back up here and to how shells work in World of Warships. Remember, your shells don't all go exactly where you're aiming. They land in an ellipse, and especially since the ellipse can't catch the broadside of a ship, you're truly aiming in an ellipse against the water, so your dispersion is effectively greater than it would be against other surface targets. So, I personally recommend loading HE against submarines. Each individual shell will do less damage, but you'll hit significantly more shells. I'm not going to say twice the amount of shells because of how Sigma works for high Sigma battleships, but you'll hit significantly more shells, which will offset the damage penalty. And more importantly, HE shells will incapacitate submarines and cause fires to submarines even upon splashing hits. And they're more likely to cause fuel leaks. Or at least I found. Maybe that's not true, but you hit more shells, so if each shell has the same chance to cause a fuel leak, you have a higher chance to cause a fuel leak per salvo. So that's worth noting. Once again, you can find all your splash radiuses here. For ship-mounted depth charges, this is any depth charge that falls off a ship physically from pressing the G key. You will deal splash damage within 800 meters. If you are within 800 meters of a submarine, you do splash damage. It is the same amount of damage, whether it's at 200 meters or 800 meters. It does the same amount of damage. For airstrike depth charges, it's different for airstrike depth charges. I'll bring it down here. So these nice little graphics here will show you exactly what you're doing in damage when using depth charges against submarines. This is an example of surface-based depth charges, so ship-based depth charges. This is 800 meters. So within 800 meters, you will do 1,650 damage with a daring depth charge. But if you land it within 120 meters of a submarine, it will deal its full damage, or citadel damage. It's its alpha damage, per se. That's why I think it's a good comparison, because if you notice, this is 1/3 the damage. So it's a good way to think about it is landing a direct hit with a ship-based depth charge is getting a citadel. Landing a splashing hit is getting a full pen. Because if you land a direct hit, you do your full damage. But it's a very small window. 120 meters is a very small window, so you do not get very many direct hit with depth charges. I will mention at this point, I see people all the time, they don't lead their depth charges. I don't understand why. You have to aim your depth charges not to land where the target will be when they land on the water. You need to aim your depth charges to be where the target will be when the depth charge explodes. It sounds like a simple concept, but people can't seem to get their heads around it. drop your depth charges in front of the submarine's path. Don't drop them on top of the submarine when it's moving. Don't drop them behind the submarine when it's going away from you. Well, actually, I suppose depth charges, their charges last so long you can afford to, and you might kill them a little quicker. But the overall goal is to get direct hits, so if you can afford to, you lead the submarine, just as you would lead your artillery, just as you lead torpedoes. Drop your depth charges so they fall in front of the submarine and they detonate approximately when you would get a direct hit. Now, of course, once again, I also will mention, if it's not a direct hit, it's a splash hit. It doesn't matter how far away it is. So if you're not going to get a direct hit, or you don't want to get direct hits because you have a high enough alpha and you drop enough depth charges to just outright kill it with splash damage, say like something like a Shimakaze, or once again a Daring, you don't really need direct hits because your depth charges do so much damage to start with. You don't need direct hits, and you can afford to just be within this 800-meter circle. But something like Pan-Asian depth charges, which are rather comical in the fact that they do less alpha damage than a 5-inch HE shell. No, that's not a joke. Yeah, you probably want to aim for direct hits with those things. At least you drop a lot of them, right? But it is different when you are looking at airdropped depth charges. Airdrop depth charges are different. Now, Siegfried and Aegir drop 3 depth charges instead of 2 or 1, so they have different ellipses. That's such a specific scenario, I'm not going to cover it. Every other air-based depth charge in the game, besides CVs, follows this formula here. Within 150 meters, a bigger radius than ship-based depth charges, and easier to hit since you can put them wherever you want, you will deal direct full damage within this ellipse. If you get a splashing hit, which is a significantly lower range than ship-based depth charges, you will deal not a third for like ship-based depth charges, you will deal 1/2 for airstrike depth charges. So this is 1/2 of the damage of the alpha damage. So 2 splashing hits will always do the same amount of damage as 1 direct hit. And usually you can never get 2 splashing hits usually. It's possible, but it's so precise to get 2 splashing hits with 1 airstrike that it's just not feasibly possible. So realistically, you either get a splashing hit or a direct hit, because even though you drop 2 depth charges, you're only ever going to hit 1 of them for the most part. And this little outer radius out here is your incapacitation flooding radius. Within 300 meters to 375 meters, you have a chance to cause flooding and a chance to incapacitate modules on the submarine. And I believe a chance to cause fire as well. So this is your chance area. If you get within 300 meters and you get a splashing hit or direct hit ribbon, you will always, unless their DCP is running, cause a flood to a submarine with an airborne depth charge. Not with ship-based. They have different flooding radius or chances. I don't know why. But you will always cause flooding to a submarine if you're within 300 meters of them with an airstrike. It is worth mentioning that I have absolutely no idea how fuel leaks work. I think they're supposed to proc upon any damage to the submarine. I think they usually do. Fuel leaks will last 40 seconds if you are submerged or at periscope depth. They will fix themselves instantly if you are on the surface without DCP. DCP will also always instantly fix a oil leak regardless of the depth you are at, but I would not use your DCP charges just to fix an oil slick unless it's a hyper-specific scenario like you're juking someone's airstrike and you can't surface because you'd be detected or something like that. It's also worth noting that American submarine DCPs last 15 seconds, which is rather long. It makes them good in submarine fights in that it's hard to get pings on them if you can take advantage of that 15-second window, but of course they're already at a disadvantage in that their submarine surveillance is only 6 kilometers compared to like Germany's 9 kilometers. But they last the same amount of time. And also, American submarines have worse detection overall, so I'd say they're about equal in a submarine fight. It depends how you know to use your ship's strengths and abuse the enemy's weaknesses. Once again, you should aim airstrikes. The timer you see when you start an airstrike is the time until detonation. You should always be aiming for a direct hit, of course. Make sure to account for if they're turning. It's really easy to do because you have an aerial view and you can just take a while. Don't instantly, when you see a submarine, don't see which direction they're going and just spam click both your depth charges in front of them. That's a bad idea. Take a second. Look at them. Just observe them for all of 1 or 2 seconds and see where they're going. See if they're turning, see how fast they're moving, and then make your judgment based on that. Then you can drop your airstrikes, and usually you'll find yourself getting significantly more direct hits. You'll find that it's actually not that hard to get direct hits on submarines if you just take a second, stop, and look at where the submarine is actually going to be. I mean, I don't know why people instantly drop their depth charges and expect to get like 50 direct hits right in a row when they didn't even take time to see where the target's going. That's like if the second someone was spotted, you just clicked directly on them and you didn't even see what direction they were going, or if they were turning, or if they were going to run into an island, you didn't even take any of that into account for shell lead. You just clicked on them. Of course you're going to miss. Why did you expect citadels when you aimed like for the stern, you know? I mean, it makes really no sense. People think weird. I don't know. Now, let's cover CVs. Oh, yay, our favorite. CVs. They have automatic depth charges. They are not player controlled. They cannot be player controlled. All CVs have a significantly larger airstrike radius than other airstrikes. They have a 600 meter total. It's almost the range. It's 75% of the range of a splashing hit from ship-based depth charges. But here you can see a direct hit is within 300 meters, which is basically double the size. You can also see their damage, 4,900. Thankfully, they actually did standardize the damage, roughly. There's some exceptions, of course, as per always. But they standardized it pretty well. Submarines are, when submarines are detected in any form within a CV's strike range, they will automatically send out the plane and strike it. I'll go back and pull it up. You can look at this stuff. You also, that also does not look like half, does it? That's not, interesting. For some reason, they're splashing. It looks like that's 2/3 if I had to guess without doing the math. For some reason, they do 2/3 damage coefficient instead of everyone else's half because, I don't know, they're wargaming special little class, I guess. If I can find it somewhere, where is it? Depth charge airstrike data. Here we go. It's important to know if you're playing submarines, especially in which range all carriers have. Now, I don't know what the odd tier carriers, when they add those, I don't know what their ranges are going to be, but it's worth noting. Nope, don't go to that. Come on, there we go. Tier 6 carriers have a 6-kilometer range. Tier 8 carriers have a 7-kilometer range. Tier 10 and super carriers have an 8-kilometer range. This is, that I know of, without exception. So just memorize these 3 values if you're a submarine. That way you know from what range you can safely harass enemy carriers with pings. Because as you know, they also have automatic damage control, which will react to submarine pings in the same way it reacts to fires. It will pretty much immediately activate the damage control once it gets pinged. And you are now on a minute cooldown until you can ping them again. Enemy automatic ASW from carriers will strike a submarine if they detect an oil spill within their strike range, a ping within their strike range, or outright detect them within their strike range. Any of those things and they'll automatically strike. They are very accurate and they do leave the target accurately enough to reliably get direct hits and almost always get splashing hits. Rarely will you ever find yourself in this outer square or circle area. You're always going to find yourself within these first like 2 circles. They have really good ASW, but you cannot manually control it. You'll notice that their damage is about on par with other airstrikes. Everyone expected that. Same flooding chances, whatever. They only have 1 stored charge. They do not have 2 stored charges like other battleships might. Every CV only has 1 stored charge, but it reloads faster than 30 seconds at 25 seconds. So they have 25-second intervals between each strike. But they start with 1 immediately. I haven't seen anywhere to see this cooldown, but it doesn't really matter since you don't have control over it anyway. So ironically, the best way to counter a submarine and a carrier is go pop fighters over the enemy submarine to spot them and run directly at them. Well, not directly, at an oblique angle at them. Get it within your strike range and really just try and dodge the best you can. I mean, this is since it's basically all automated, it's really a game of who knows what they're doing more. Does the submarine have hands? He'll probably just surface and dev strike you. But at the same time, if he allows himself to get spotted 1 too many times, you'll just dev strike him. It's a rather binary system. It's really weird. As you can see, here are your exceptions. Ohio and Thunderer, for some reason, I have no idea why, just have 6-kilometer ASW, even though every other battleship has 11-kilometer ASW, because why not? Massachusetts, black. Oh, and a black. Massachusetts and Massachusetts black, 5-kilometer, even though everything else has a 10-kilometer. Don't know why. They just decided that would be funny, I guess. Giulio Cesar, for some reason. And for some reason, Geir and Siegfried, they gave 3 bombs to, and they do significantly lower damage. I don't, but you drop 3 bombs? I don't know what they were doing, really. If you can tell me, great. But I don't think anyone really knows how they came up with this. Why did they specifically say, you know what, Ohio and Thunderer need to not be able to use their ASW ever? Who knows? Maybe the players actually had hands because they were ships that are old-time ships, so maybe they were too effective in testing, so they're like, we got to nerf those. But that's really beyond the scope at this point. Of course, it's worth mentioning a submarine can only have 1 instance of fire and 1 instance of flooding on it at a time. Of course, DCP instantly cancels those. Surfacing does not affect firefighting or flood fighting times. It only affects oil spills. And something interesting to note, submarines, everything else when on fire, you add 2 kilometers to their base detection range. When on the surface, or at any depth actually, they don't take a concealment penalty. Submarines do not take a concealment penalty from being on fire. So you don't actually have to worry about being on the surface with a fire in a submarine. I don't know why, but that's just the way it is. I don't know if it's intentional. Ask them. I don't care. And of course, DCP is useful in submarine fights because it will clear enemy pings and basically make you invincible as long as you don't get like direct hit. Now let's go to engagement tactics of dealing with submarines, because submarines can be rather a pain to fight with. Now first things first, let's know what you're fighting. Every submarine has different little gimmicks, like American torpedoes go comically fast and they have a wider sonar ping, so it's easier for them to get double pings. German torpedoes do more damage, but they go slightly slower. I'm not going to say slow. They go faster than Shimakaze torpedoes, but it's pretty obvious to tell the difference between a tracking torpedo and a dumbfire torpedo. I mean, if you're pinged or not, and plus the little pulsating thing around them. Yeah. Anyway, it's worth noting dodging, because dodging is, you don't actually really have to waste your damage control when it comes to submarines. You can dodge torpedoes fairly easily in most scenarios. There are ways that you can guarantee a hit in a submarine, and especially like with Alliance. It works especially well with Alliance if you're pushing Alliance. But all submarines have their standard homing ranges. It's worth notice, once again, aircraft carriers just for some reason get special. I don't know why. Double pings still last longer, so it's worth going for them, I guess. But I mean, they don't track any better. They pull harder, but they don't guide longer. Battleships, they barely guide longer, but whatever. Cruisers are really worth getting those double pings because they will guide twice, well, half the distance, right? Not twice as long. They'll guide to half the distance otherwise, so it's significantly more likely to cruiser with a double ping. Plus, double ping torpedoes pull harder than single ping torpedoes. That's anecdotal, but I think it's true because it really feels like they do. Destroyers is the same thing. It goes from 400 meters to 200 meters, which is basically, I mean, in this game, 200 meters is like basically contact. I mean, the torpedoes already hit you at 200 meters. I mean, 200 meters is nothing. And for submarines, literally on your forehead, they never stop homing if you get a double ping. So really go for those double pings in submarine fights. Also, practice pinging maneuvering submarines underwater. It's a lot harder than it seems, and for some reason underwater, your pings actually don't have width. They are a single pixel. I don't know why. It changes per tier. These are all the normal submarines, and these are your special submarines, which means premium submarines you had to pay real money for, so of course they're better, naturally. I-56 is nothing to note, but Alliance, of course, its torpedoes only go like 42 or 48 knots, so I mean, you can probably just outrun them, quite frankly, but they're really annoying to deal with in that they basically never stop homing. As you can see, these distances are rather comical. 70 meters. I mean, I'm pretty, yeah, that's ramming distance. I mean, you've rammed the enemy if you're in a ship at 70 meters at that point. So, yeah, in battleships, you can just notice it's like half. It's like you go up here to like the tier 8. It goes from 1.8 and 1.5 to 9 and 0.75. It's ridiculous. And Soviet submarine, I don't really. What are they, worse? I don't even know what tier. I think this is a tier 10. Looks the same to me. Yeah, look, I don't know why they're. I'm sure there's a different. Who knows? Maybe it's actually a tier 8 and it has tier 10 homing. Also, pings last longer. Only double pings do. Single pings always last 25 seconds, depending on the tier. These last longer unless it's S189, in which case 30 seconds. You know. So, it's worth noting that. Okay, the entire point of that ramble was get the torpedo into the range in which it's going to stop pulling and turn and swing out of the way of it. And you can start, if you're pulling the torpedo towards you to start with, and it's going to have to overcorrect, you can make it miss even further if you know what you're doing. It really just turn. Like, I know I'm literally saying just dodge, get good, just dodge, but just practice it a little bit. It's actually really easy to dodge. Now, there are certain scenarios in which you can manage your pings in a submarine to guarantee hits better, like because it's really easy to dodge torpedoes that are aimed at your nose. You just swing your nose out of the way. But if they're aimed at the center of your ship, you can't really swing in the same way unless you can drift in a cruiser. So that's the best place to aim for battleships. And if it's on your stern, you can swing your stern out of the way, kind of, if you know what you're doing. But it's an interesting strategy to aim for the nose of a battleship, and then if you think it's going to try and swing its nose out of the way, you can ping its stern so the torpedoes will pull but stop homing, and they'll usually hit it right in the center if you time it right. It's an interesting strategy if you messed up your ping, the location of it. Now let's get to engaging the submarines. Submarines do not have access to any concealment modifications. Their concealment is their concealment. That's that. On the surface, they have their listed concealment of whatever it is, like 6 kilometers for salmon, for example. They can actually have, as they dive from surface to periscope, they actually have incremented concealment. So as they're halfway to periscope, their concealment will be something like 4.8, for example. Doesn't really, it's oddly specific, it doesn't really matter. At periscope depth, their spotting distance is usually somewhere between 2.1 and 2.6, depending on the submarine. And of course, assured detection works both on the surface and at periscope depth. As for their spotting abilities, actually, let's cover aircraft spotting. Aircraft will spot enemy submarines that are on the surface or at periscope depth from the same range. It's usually, once again, about their periscope detection. It's about 2.5 to like 2.1 kilometers. It doesn't change whether you're on the surface or periscope. It's the exact same. And it should note that submarines are still considered at periscope depth while diving to maximum depth until they reach whatever threshold they need to reach. So you can't really dolphin dive unless you're in Gato. But hey, that one's a steel ship, so it's allowed to be overpowered, right? It's not really it's actually, what no, it is. It's complicated. It's overpowered, though. It's just situationally overpowered, let me put it that way. When going at an enemy submarine, go at an oblique angle. All that means is don't point your nose directly at the submarine. That makes it really easy for him to just shotgun you. Also, don't go full broadside to the submarine. That makes it really easy for him to shotgun you. So, like, a 30-degree angle, 45, maybe, and be good at dodging torpedoes. Know that if you get within about 900 meters to 600 meters, they won't arm. It's a rather close distance, but it's worth knowing the arming distances. And know how to dodge torpedoes. If they're aimed at your nose, cut throttle, turn in. If they're aimed at your stern, turn in and swing your stern out of the way. If they're aimed at your midsection, turn in. The only time you would ever turn out, really, I don't really think you should ever turn out. Turning in, because you want to get closer to the submarine, of course. Plus, if you turn out, you get broadside to the submarine, which just makes it really easy to get those Citadel hits on you. Because, of course, saturation on nose parts exists. So if you're going to take torpedoes, take them all on the nose. That way they saturate. Unless you're in a battleship, in which case take on the torpedo protection on the nose. That way it both saturates and hits the torpedo protection. And doesn't do Citadel damage, so it can be healed. And also, once you're within... If you're charging at a submarine and they're aiming at you, you should probably start dropping your depth charges. Once again, lead your depth charges. Think about where your depth charges are going to be when they explode. Shoot the submarine if it tries to surface. Punish it the most you can. If you're getting shotgunned, like if a Gato appears like to your broadside Thunderer or something, like you're in Vermont and a Gato just appears on your broadside and 6 gearing torpedoes are coming for you, and that's it. You're gonna die. There's nothing you can do about it. You can't dodge them. Don't just die. Take him, or take as much health from him as you can. Punish him if you can spot him. See where the torpedoes appeared. If you can't physically spot him, assume that he's at least more than like 2.1 kilometers away from you and drop your depth charges about there. See where the torpedoes appeared. That's probably about where he is, unless they were from a long distance. And if he gets himself spotted while shotgunning you, just drop up your depth charges and do as much damage to him as you can. Yeah, you're probably going to die. It's probably not very fun or balanced exactly, but I guess you could think about it in a similar way to a Kleber rushing someone. They come around a corner, they dev strike them with torpedoes, but they And we're back. My headset turned itself off. Anyway, so think about it like that. Yes, I know this is a long video. Oh well, there's a lot to describe about submarines. So know your splash radiuses and all that. That's nice to know. Once again, you should just be trying to aim for direct hits anyway. And blind firing submarines is probably the last thing we need to cover. I'm going to say this now. Only rush a submarine with ship-based depth charges if, one, you're okay with dying and know you can get the depth charges off before you get killed, or only do it if you're not going to get shot to death by the rest of the enemy team, so when they're secluded. If you really want, I recommend not ramming them, because if you're close enough to ram them, you're close enough to, one, be within their torpedo arming distance, and two, depth charge them with direct hits, no less. Oh, and it's worth noting that I don't actually think depth charges vertical distance when they detonate means anything. I think it's absolute distance, like on the surface. It's almost like a 2D grid depth charges act on, so think of it that way. Also, technically in this game, for some reason they decided that when you're at 30 meters down, you're actually 60 meters down, and when you're 60 meters down, you're actually 120 meters down. I don't know why. They can't keep any of their measurements straight, like, in this game. None of the measurements are the same. So I just don't. It doesn't matter. Just aim the depth charges. And if an enemy submarine is pinging multiple times, just see where the pings are going. It's going to be within 1 kilometer of them. That white little arc that appears is going to be within 1 kilometer of the enemy submarine. Aim that. See, if you see 2 of them, aim behind that, right behind that white arc, because it comes off the front of them, and take the average of your 2 pings, put it in the middle, see which direction they were going, and lead the time appropriately. So lead a little more than the distance between those, is what I'd say. See if they're turning roughly. Just do your best to estimate where they're going with those 2 pings. Also, oil leaks are exactly accurate to a submarine's position, but once again, don't drop it on the oil leak, drop it where the oil leak is going. Because they're not just going to sit there in the oil leak unless they are sitting there in the oil leak, which maybe like that's a 5,000 IQ strat, but probably not. Don't do that. Look for where they're going. If they're turning, if it's going in an arch, if you can draw an arch between the 2, they're turning. So lead it as such. I recommend leading it to where you predict them stop turning and you predict them still turning. You can do that by putting the top depth charge if they were to straighten out, and the bottom depth charges if they were to going straight with that 1 depth charge strike. Since they drop in that long rectangle, you can do that. If someone has an oil leak, there's really no excuse not to have 100% accuracy, really. With at least splashing hits, quite frankly, you should be getting direct hits because it's exact to their position. It's as good as them being spotted periodically, I guess. It's also possible if someone's pinged enemy. Okay, so enemy locations, last known locations, will update if they are detected by a hydrophone ping or if they are pinged by a submarine's ping, and it updates the acoustic homing torpedo. It also updates their last known position. This applies to submarines as well, so if an enemy submarine is pinged by hydrophone or pinged by an enemy submarine's homing torpedo lock-on, it will update their position, and you can look at the minimap, just pump up the minimap size and look at where they're going, and you can lead it based off that. You lead it by looking at the minimap. It's basically like playing Battleship, except, you're also getting shot at by 10 other battleships at the same time. It's really fun. But you can also do blind fire stuff like that. You don't necessarily need to be able to see it. Think about like shooting someone in a cyclone. Same concept. So that's really all there is to know about fighting submarines and being a submarine. It's really important to know the enemy's abilities. It's really important to know how things work. I recommend you pick up a Tier 6 submarine and just try it out. Like, pick yourself up a Tier 6 submarine and see how they feel. Know what gets a submarine killed. That way you can know what good submarine players are doing, because you learn to play the submarine, so you learn what other good submarine players might do. You learn how to dodge depth charges, so by learning how to dodge depth charges, you learn how to aim depth charges better because you understand how submarines maneuver better. I recommend you play, and if you're a submarine main, I also alternatively recommend go play a couple of matches of battleships. Learn how to dodge your own torpedoes. Learning your own ship's weaknesses is a very important part of playing a ship well. So, just by learning some of these things, once again, you can come to ship tool to filter it out, come to the wiki, look at these things, practice it, and you'll be countering submarines just fine. So that's really all there is to submarines. There's probably some more minute things I missed, but I've already rambled way too long. How long have we been up? An hour. Wow, this is going to take forever to upload. And I really doubt anyone's going to watch it in its entirety. But oh well, hey, how much do you want to know about submarines, right? Well, this is Submarines 101. Thank you for watching.